The contracts were already on the table when Lourdes Vega walked in with her mop bucket. Nobody looked up. That was the thing about being the overnight cleaning staff at Hargrove Pryce Capital Management. You learned very quickly that the people in the glass offices didn't see you. Not really. You were furniture, a fixture, something that kept the marble floors gleaming and the wastebaskets empty so that the men in their tailored suits could feel like gods in a clean heaven. Lourdes had worked the overnight shift at Hargrove Pryce for 3 years. She was 31 years old, 5'4", and built the way her grandmother had called it, substantial. She had her mother's wide hips and her father's stubborn jaw, and a brain that had been quietly absorbing languages since she was 4 years old, listening to her Salvadoran grandmother, her Filipino mother, her German-born father, and the rotating cast of neighbors in their Queens apartment building who spoke everything from Mandarin to Polish to Haitian Creole. She had a master's degree in computational linguistics from NYU. Nobody at Hargrove Pryce knew that. Nobody had ever asked. She pushed her cart through the glass door of the 42nd floor conference room at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, expecting to find it empty the way she always did. Instead, she found 8 men seated around the long mahogany table, and the air in the room was so tight with tension that Lourdes nearly turned around right then and walked back out. The man at the head of the table stopped her. "Leave it." His name was Kieran Ashby. She knew him the way she knew all the executives, from the plaques on the doors, the names on the building directory, the way the daytime staff whispered about him. Kieran Ashby was the founder and CEO of Hargrove Pryce, 43 years old, and the kind of man who made other powerful men nervous. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved specifically to intimidate, sharp jaw, dark eyes, the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that silence did more damage than shouting. "I said leave it," he repeated, and his voice was quiet in the specific way that meant he was not going to say it a third time. Lourdes set her mop against the wall and backed toward the door. That was when she heard it. The man sitting to Kieran Ashby's left, a lean, silver-haired figure in a charcoal suit who had been introduced in the documents, spread across the table as Peter Vandermeer, lead representative of the Vandermeer Consortium out of Rotterdam, leaned toward the man beside him and murmured something in Dutch. "She's too fat to move fast, let her stay. It doesn't matter." The man beside him, younger, watchful, with the careful eyes of someone paid to notice things, replied in the same language. "Are you sure? Ashby doesn't look happy about it." Vandermeer's mouth curved. "Ashby doesn't speak Dutch. Neither does anyone else in this room. That's the whole point." Lourdes kept her face completely blank. She stood with her back near the door and her hands folded in front of her, and she did not look at Peter Vandermeer, and she did not let a single muscle in her face move. She understood every word. She had been speaking Dutch since she was 7 years old. A neighbor, Mrs. de Groot, 3rd floor, apartment 3C, who had fed Lourdes stroopwafels and Dutch soap operas for 4 years until the woman moved back to Amsterdam. Lourdes had kept the language the way she kept all of them, folded neatly into the back of her mind, waiting. Kieran Ashby was looking at the documents again. He didn't know the meeting was about a merger. Lourdes understood that much from context. The papers on the table, the body language, the fact that 2 of the men on Ashby's side kept glancing at a set of financial projections that she could see from where she stood were marked confidential, Series D acquisition. Hargrove Pryce was being acquired, or trying to be. Something was happening with the terms and it wasn't going well. She could see it in the way Ashby held his jaw. He had a translator. A man named, she read the nameplate on the table, Hendrik Joost, who was presumably Dutch, sitting to Ashby's right with a legal pad and a pen. But Hendrik Joost was not translating accurately. Lourdes had been listening for 4 minutes now, and she could hear the gaps. Vandermeer would say something, and Joost would translate a version of it that was close but not exact. And in contract negotiation, close but not exact was the difference between a deal and a disaster. Vandermeer knew it too. The silver-haired man had the patient expression of someone who understood that the clock was working in his favor. Lourdes should have left, she knew she should have left. She had a cart full of cleaning supplies and a shift that ended at 6 a.m. and absolutely no business being in this room. She was the overnight cleaning staff. She was 31 years old and built like her grandmother, and she had a linguistics degree that nobody had ever asked about, and she was going to push her cart back into the hallway and finish the executive bathrooms and go home. Vandermeer said something else in Dutch. His colleague laughed, very quietly. By the time Joost finishes mistranslating Clause 7, Ashby will have signed away the Eastern portfolio. He won't even know what he gave up until it's too late. Lourdes looked at the floor. She looked at her hands. She thought about the 3 years she had spent on this floor, the nights she had polished that particular table, the way the men in the glass offices walked past her like she was part of the building. She thought about her grandmother, who had worked as a hotel maid in San Salvador for 20 years and raised 4 children on what she earned, and never once been asked her name by the men who left their rooms for her to clean. She walked to the table. Every head in the room turned. Kieran Ashby looked up, and his expression was not anger exactly. It was the controlled, icy version of it that was somehow worse. "I told you to leave. Your translator is mistranslating Clause 7, Lourdes said. The room went completely silent. Joost straightened in his chair. "I beg your—" "Clause 7, Lourdes said again, and she kept her voice level, because if she let it shake now it was over. "Mr. Vandermeer's team has proposed Voorkeursrecht over de Oostelijke portefeuille, preferential right over the Eastern portfolio. Mr. Joost translated it as voorkeur voor samenwerking op de Oostelijke markt, preference for cooperation on the Eastern market. They are not the same thing. One is a right. The other is a preference. A right is enforceable. A preference is not." Nobody moved. Peter Vandermeer's patient expression had not changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted. Very slightly, very carefully, the way a card player's face shifts when the other person at the table turns over an unexpected hand. Kieran Ashby looked at Lourdes for a long moment. Then he looked at Joost. "Is that accurate?" Joost's face had gone the color of old paper. "The nuance is that accurate?" It was not a question the second time. Joost did not answer. Ashby pushed back from the table and turned to look at Lourdes with an expression she had never seen on any of the executives' faces when they looked at her. It wasn't warmth, exactly. It was the particular attention of a man who had just realized he had been wrong about something important. "Sit down," he said. "I'm the cleaning staff," Lourdes said. "I'm aware of what you are," Ashby said. "Sit down." She sat. What followed was 4 hours that Lourdes would spend years trying to properly describe to people who hadn't been in the room. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of dramatic pivot that happened in movies, where the unlikely hero steps forward and everything resolves cleanly. It was difficult and precise and exhausting in the way that real things are. Vandermeer's team pushed back immediately. The silver-haired man smiled at Lourdes with the particular condescension of someone who has been caught doing something and has decided that offense is the better strategy. "Forgive me," he said in lightly accented English. "But I'm not certain." He glanced at her cleaning cart near the door. "Cleaning woman is the appropriate person to be interpreting legal documents." "She's doing better than your translator," Ashby said, and his voice was so flat and so cold that Vandermeer said nothing else for 40 seconds. But the Vandermeer team had not come to Rotterdam, or wherever it was they came from, in their expensive suits to be undone by a cleaning lady who spoke Dutch. They shifted strategies. The man to Vandermeer's right, the watchful one, whose nameplate read Jan Broekhuis, legal counsel, began to conduct side conversations in Flemish, which was related to Dutch but distinct enough that most people who spoke one couldn't fully follow the other. Lourdes followed it without difficulty. She had spent 2 years corresponding with a researcher at Ghent University for her thesis, and had picked up Flemish the way she picked up everything. Through sheer accumulated exposure and the particular stubbornness of a person who had been told her whole life that she was not the kind of person things were meant for. They're discussing whether to invoke the force majeure provision, she said quietly to Ashby when Broquis had finished his murmured exchange with Vandermeer. They think if they can demonstrate market volatility in the eastern sector, they can reduce the acquisition premium by 12% without renegotiating the base terms. Ashby turned to look at her. Can they? Not if your legal team added the index clause I think I saw on page 43, Lourdes said. The one that ties the premium to the 3-month rolling average rather than the spot price. Ashby looked at the man on his far left, who was presumably his legal counsel, and who was staring at Lourdes with an expression that contained several emotions at once. Is the index clause in there? Yes. Yes, it's in there. Then we're fine, Ashby said, and turned back to the table. Vandermeer said something in Dutch, not to Broquis this time, to the room, in the way of a man who doesn't expect to be understood. Where did they find her? Lourdes answered him in Dutch, calmly, without looking up from the document she was reviewing. I've been here for 3 years. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. It was the silence of men recalibrating. Vandermeer looked at her for a long time. Then, very slowly, something that might have been respect crossed his face, or at least its closest neighbor. Your Dutch is excellent, he said in English now, deliberately. Thank you, Lourdes said. My Flemish is better. Broquis made a sound that was almost a laugh. The negotiations resumed. They were hard. Vandermeer was not a man who surrendered ground easily, and his team had prepared for a version of this meeting that did not include Lourdes Vega, and the recalibration cost them time and momentum. But the index clause held. The Eastern portfolio stayed intact. By 3 in the morning, the revised terms were on the table, and Ashby's legal team was reviewing them with the focused intensity of people who understood what they'd nearly lost. At 3:47 a.m., Peter Vandermeer signed. He stood to shake Ashby's hand, and then, to the visible surprise of everyone in the room, including Lourdes, he crossed to where she was sitting and extended his hand to her. You are, he said, with the careful precision of a man selecting his words, not what I expected. No, Lourdes agreed and shook his hand. I know. After the Vandermeer team filed out, the conference room emptied quickly, lawyers gathering documents, the 2 men from Ashby's financial team conferring over something in low, urgent voices, the energy of the room deflating from high tension to exhausted relief. Lourdes stood up and went to retrieve her cleaning cart. She turned around. Kieran Ashby was standing at the head of the table. He'd loosened his tie at some point in the last hour, and the effect was strangely humanizing, the iron CEO looking slightly less like a marble statue than usual. How did you know, he said. The mistranslation. How did you know what Jos was saying was wrong? I speak Dutch, Lourdes said. I understood that part. A pause. How many languages do you speak? She considered lying. It would have been easier. A comfortable number. Something that made sense. Instead, she said 9. Fluently. Something moved across Ashby's face. You've been cleaning this building for 3 years. Yes. And nobody. He stopped. Started again. Nobody knew. Nobody asked, Lourdes said. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was thinking, not emptiness. I need to ask you something, he said. And I need you to answer honestly. All right. Why didn't you leave? When I told you to. Lourdes looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the mahogany table, at the stack of documents, at the place where Vandermeer's nameplate had been sitting an hour ago. Because Just was going to let you sign away the Eastern portfolio, she said. And I've spent 3 years polishing that table. Ashby stared at her. Then, unexpectedly, quietly, he laughed. Not a polished laugh, not an executive's managed chuckle. Something real, something that reached his eyes. What's your full name? Lourdes Vega. He said it back like he was committing it to memory. Lourdes Vega, then, do you have a degree? Computational linguistics. NYU. Another pause, longer this time. My head of international contracts just resigned last month, Ashby said. We've been looking for a replacement. Lourdes looked at him steadily. I have a cleaning shift that ends at 6 a.m. I'm aware, Ashby said. I'm also aware that you just saved this company somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 million. He reached into his jacket pocket and set a business card on the table between them. My assistant's number is on the back. Call before 9. We'll have HR draw up the paperwork. Lourdes looked at the card. She looked at Kieran Ashby. He was watching her with the focused, direct attention of a man who had spent a career assessing value and had just discovered he'd been looking in the wrong places. You don't know anything about me, she said. I know you speak 11 languages, Ashby said. I know you have a master's from NYU. I know you caught a mistranslation in a language you had no reason to speak and saved a negotiation that 18 people with law degrees and six-figure salaries had been preparing for 3 months. A pause. I know that when I told you to leave, you stayed anyway, because it was the right thing to do. He met her eyes. I know enough. Lourdes picked up the card. She turned it over. Read the name on the back. A woman named Patricia Osei, executive assistant to the CEO. She set the card carefully in the front pocket of her uniform. I'll call at 8, she said. She pushed her cart toward the door. Lourdes. She stopped. The thing you said about polishing the table. Ashby's voice was quieter now. Something in it she hadn't heard before. I'm sorry that you've been here 3 years and no one. He stopped. I'm sorry. It was not the apology of a man performing contrition. It was the apology of someone who had looked at something clearly for the first time and didn't like what he saw. Lourdes had been around enough people to know the difference. Thank you, she said. She meant it. She pushed her cart back into the hallway, and the glass door swung shut behind her, and she stood alone in the quiet corridor for a moment with the hum of the building around her. The HVAC system, the distant sound of an elevator, the 42nd floor of Hargrove Pryce Capital Management at 4 o'clock in the morning. She finished her shift. She mopped the executive bathrooms. She emptied the wastebaskets. She cleaned the glass door of the conference room where 3 hours ago she had translated a $40 million negotiation in her cleaning uniform. She did it thoroughly, the way she did everything, because she had never seen the point of doing a thing halfway. At 5:58 a.m., she clocked out. She sat in her car in the parking garage and called her mother. Her mother answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, which meant she'd known something was happening the way she always did, the way women who have spent their lives paying attention always do. Mija, her mother said. You sound different. Something happened tonight, Lourdes said, she told her. When she was done, her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the mix of Spanish and English and Tagalog that they'd always spoken at home, your grandmother would have laughed. Then she would have cried. Then she would have made you eat something. Lourdes laughed. First time in hours. I'm going to call HR at 8, she said. I know you are, her mother said. I know. At 8 o'clock exactly, Lourdes called Patricia Osei. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. At 8:14, Patricia said she would have a formal offer drafted by end of day, and asked Lourdes what her availability looked like for orientation the following Monday. Lourdes thought about the cleaning cart, the uniform, the way the elevator doors opened onto the 42nd floor at 11:45 p.m. and the building felt like it belonged to no one and everyone at once. Monday works, she said. At 8:23 a.m., her phone buzzed with a text from an unsaved number. The index clause was on page 43. Lourdes stared at it. She typed back, I know. I read it while Vandermeer's team was signing. 3 minutes passed. Of course you did. Then, after another pause, thank you for staying. Lourdes set her phone on the passenger seat and looked at the concrete wall of the parking garage and thought about her grandmother who had cleaned hotel rooms in San Salvador for 20 years and never once been asked her name. She thought about Miss de Groot on the 3rd floor of the Queen's apartment building, feeding a 7-year-old stroopwafels and Dutch soap operas, saying, You have good ears, little one. You hear everything. She thought about the NYU linguistics department, where she had spent 2 years being the only person in her cohort who took the night bus home, and the only one who worked a second job to cover rent, and the only one who had ever had a professor look at her research and say, with genuine surprise, "This is exceptional work, Miss Vega. How did you learn to think this way?" By listening, she had said, "I've always been good at listening." The parking garage was very quiet. Lourdes Vega picked up her phone and saved the number under K. Ashby. Then she put the car in drive and headed home, into the early morning light of a city that was just waking up. That was loud and complicated and full of languages she already knew, and a few she was still learning, and somewhere above her, on the 42nd floor of a glass building, with a very clean marble floor, a business card sat in an evidence box marked Vandermeer Acquisition, closed, and on the conference room table, her name was written in the margin of a legal document in Kieran Ashby's handwriting, with a single word beside it: indispensable.